They thought I had no one. That was the mistake. The kind of mistake people only make when they're too confident, too comfortable, too convinced that silence means weakness and standing alone means you're finished. I stood in that room by myself while they whispered, exchanged looks, and spoke about me like I wasn't even there, like I was already defeated, like the outcome had already been decided. And for a moment, just a moment, I let them believe it. It started the way these things always do, quietly. Not with shouting or confrontation, but with subtle exclusion, meetings I wasn't invited to, decisions that happened organically without my input, conversations that stopped when I entered the room. I noticed. I always noticed. But I didn't react. I never did. Because reacting had never helped me before. I worked harder instead, stayed later, proved myself again and again, thinking that if I just showed enough effort, respect would eventually follow. It didn't. Instead, the narrative started forming without me. She doesn't have anyone backing her. She's easy to push out. She won't fight back. They said those things with certainty, because from where they stood, I was alone. The room where everything came to a head was cold. Sterile, too bright, the kind of place where people feel powerful simply because they're seated on the other side of the table. I sat alone on one side, my hands folded tightly in my lap. Across from me were faces I'd known for years, faces that used to smile when I entered, faces that now looked bored, irritated, superior. One of them cleared his throat. "We're concerned," he said, like concern was something he'd ever felt for me. Another chimed in, "There have been complaints." "What kind?" I asked calmly. They exchanged looks. "General concerns," someone said, "about your performance, your fit." Fit. That word again. It always came out when people wanted to remove you without saying why. "I'd like specifics," I said. They didn't like that. "You're being defensive," one woman said sharply. I smiled faintly. "I'm asking for clarity," I replied. More looks, more whispers. They weren't prepared for me to push back, but they still weren't worried because they believed something critical. They believed no one would stand with me. "You should consider resigning," one of them said finally. "It would be easier for everyone." Easier. Not fair. Not right. Just easier. I looked around the table. "And if I don't?" I asked. The man leaned back in his chair. "Then this becomes formal," he said. "And without representation, that's not going to go well for you." There it was. The assumption. I was on my own. I felt my pulse in my ears, but my voice stayed steady. "I'll need time," I said. They nodded, already satisfied. "Of course," someone replied. "Take the weekend." The meeting ended quickly after that. They stood, gathered their papers, and walked out in clusters, already discussing next steps, already confident in the outcome. No one looked back at me. I sat there long after the room emptied, not because I didn't know what to do, but because I did. And for the first time in my life, the weight of that knowledge pressed heavily on my chest. I had avoided this call for years, avoided asking for help, avoided leaning on the one person who had always shown up for me, whether I asked or not, my mother. I didn't call her right away. I drove home first, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my hands ached. Every streetlight blurred as I replayed the meeting over and over. The smirks, the confidence, the way they spoke like my future was already sealed. They didn't know what they were waking up, but I did. When I finally parked, I sat in my car and stared at my phone. My mother's name was already at the top of my contacts. I hadn't spoken to her about work in years. Not really. I'd always said, "It's fine. I'm handling it. Don't worry about me." Because that's what daughters like me learn to do. Be strong, be quiet, be capable. Don't burden anyone, especially not the woman who raised you alone and worked herself into exhaustion so you could have options. But this wasn't something I could muscle through. This wasn't something effort alone could fix. This was a fight, and I wasn't meant to fight it alone. When she answered, she didn't say hello right away. She knew. She always did. "What happened?" she asked. That was all.
My throat tightened. "I think they're trying to push me out," I said. There was a pause. Not shock, not panic, calculation. "Did you sign anything?" she asked. "No." "Did you admit fault?" "No." Another pause. "Good," she said. "Where are you?" "At home. I'll be there in an hour." "I don't need you to," I started. She cut me off gently. "Yes, you do," she said, "and that's okay." The line went dead. I stared at my phone, something warm and terrifying spreading through my chest. Relief. My mother arrived exactly 1 hour later. She didn't rush inside. She stood on my porch for a moment, adjusting her coat, her posture straight, her expression calm but focused. When she stepped into my apartment, she didn't ask how I was. She looked at my face and nodded once. "They underestimated you," she said. "That means they'll underestimate me, too." I laughed weakly. "You don't even know what happened yet." She set her bag down slowly. "I know enough," she replied. "Tell me everything." So I did. I told her about the meetings, the subtle shifts, the way they'd spoken to me like I was already gone. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she sat back and folded her hands. "They think you're alone," she said. "That's why they're bold." I swallowed. "They told me I should resign." Her eyes hardened, not with anger, but with something sharper. Experience. "No," she said. "They told you to disappear quietly." I nodded. "And?" she asked. "And I didn't." A small smile appeared at the corner of her mouth. "Good," she said, "because now we get to remind them who taught you how to stand." That night, she slept on my couch. The next morning, she made coffee, like this was just another ordinary day. But it wasn't. Because while they were preparing paperwork and timelines, convinced I had no leverage, no backing, no defense, my mother was already making calls. And she wasn't calling to beg. She was calling to inform. By Monday morning, the room where they'd sat so comfortably days earlier would feel very different. Because the thing they never considered, the thing that never crossed their minds, was this. I wasn't unsupported. I was just quiet. And the woman who raised me, she was neither. By Monday morning, they were already celebrating. Not openly, of course, nothing so crude. But I could feel it in the way the emails were worded, too polite, too final, in the way calendar invites disappeared without explanation, in the way my name was suddenly missing from threads I'd been central to for years. They thought the weekend had done its job. They thought fear had settled in. They were wrong. My mother was awake before I was. I found her at my kitchen table, glasses on, laptop open, legal pad filled with neat handwriting. She looked exactly the way she had when I was a child and came home crying because a teacher had treated me unfairly. Calm, focused, already 3 steps ahead of the problem. "Sit," she said without looking up. "We have an hour." I poured coffee with shaking hands. "I don't even know where to start," I admitted. She finally looked at me. "That's because you're too close to it," she said gently. "I'm not." She slid the legal pad toward me. Timeline, dates, names, exact language. I blinked. "You believe me?" She gave me a look that stopped me cold. I didn't raise a liar. I raised a woman who minimizes herself when she shouldn't. I swallowed hard. That hit deeper than anything they'd said to me.
We worked quickly. She asked questions I hadn't even considered about policy, about documentation, about who had been present when certain statements were made. She circled phrases I'd repeated verbatim. That, she said, tapping the page, is not concern. That's intimidation. And this, she added, underlining another sentence, is a procedural violation. I stared at her. How do you know all this? She smiled faintly. Because people like them don't change their tactics, they change their language. I realized then something I'd never fully appreciated. My mother had spent her life navigating rooms where she was underestimated, where she had to be twice as prepared to be taken half as seriously. She wasn't intimidated by power, she understood it. At 9:02 a.m., my phone buzzed. An email.
Subject, follow-up meeting. We'd like to continue our conversation today at 10:30. My stomach flipped. They're moving fast, I said. Yes, my mother replied calmly, because they think you're scrambling. She closed her laptop. You won't be. The drive to the building felt different than it had on Friday. Not easier, but steadier. My mother sat beside me, hands folded, eyes forward. She wasn't giving me speeches, she wasn't hyping me up. She didn't need to. Her presence alone changed the air. When we walked into the building, the receptionist looked up, then did a double take. Oh, she said, I wasn't expecting. My daughter has a meeting, my mother said smoothly. I'll be joining. The receptionist hesitated. I'll need to check. You can, my mother replied, already stepping past the desk. Or you can add my name to the visitor log. Your choice. The receptionist added the name. I didn't miss the way her posture shifted. People always sense authority before they understand it. We arrived early. The conference room was empty, sunlight spilling across the long table. My mother chose a seat, not beside me, but slightly behind and to the side. A subtle move, intentional. She wasn't here to speak for me. She was here to remind I wasn't isolated. They arrived in pairs. First, the man who'd suggested resignation, then the woman who'd accused me of being defensive, then two others I barely recognized, support staff, I assumed, meant to make the process feel official. They stopped short when they saw her. It's important that we continue this process, the man said slowly. Just you? And who are you? My mother stood. She didn't rush. She didn't smile. She said, I'm her mother, and I'll be observing. There it was, the flicker of doubt. Is that necessary? The woman asked. Yes, my mother replied. It is. They exchanged glances. I watched the power dynamic wobble. The meeting began with familiar language.
Concerns, feedback, process. But this time, something was different. They were careful. Because now, there was a witness who wasn't invested in preserving their comfort. I answered questions directly. When they tried to generalize, my mother leaned forward slightly. Can you be specific? She asked once. The man cleared his throat. Well, there's a perception. Perception, my mother repeated. Whose? Silence. The woman tried next. We've noticed some resistance to leadership. My mother tilted her head. Resistance, she said, or disagreement. More silence. They weren't used to being questioned, especially not by someone who wasn't afraid of them. Halfway through the meeting, the tone shifted. The man leaned back in his chair. Perhaps, he said, we should revisit the idea of a mutual separation. My pulse spiked. Before I could respond, my mother spoke. No, she said simply. Everyone froze. No, the woman repeated. No, my mother said again. Because what you're describing isn't performance-related, it's retaliatory. The word landed hard. You'll want to be careful with language like that, the man warned. My mother smiled, thin, knowing. Oh, I am. That's why I chose it. They scrambled after that. Clarifications, backtracking, a sudden emphasis on collaboration. Too late. They'd revealed their hand. When the meeting ended, nothing was resolved, but everything had changed. In the elevator, I exhaled shakily. "I can't believe you said that," I whispered. My mother pressed the button calmly. "I didn't say anything untrue," she replied. The doors closed. "They'll regroup," she added, "but now they know something they didn't before." "What's that?" "That you're not alone," she said, "and you never were." That afternoon, emails started coming in.
Different tone, different wording, requests for documentation, offers to clarify expectations. My mother read each one carefully. "They're trying to regain control," she said. "Good." I stared at her. "Good?" "Yes," she said, "because now they're reacting, not directing." By evening, I was exhausted, not physically, emotionally. I sat on the couch, head in my hands. "What if this still doesn't work?" I asked quietly. My mother sat beside me. "Then we escalate," she said. "Not emotionally, strategically." I looked up. "You're not scared," I said. She shook her head. "No," she replied. "I've seen this before." She paused. "And even if it doesn't end the way you want, it will end with you intact." That mattered more than I realized. Late that night, after she'd gone to sleep, I checked my phone one last time. Another email. Subject: Revised agenda. We'd like to revisit Monday's discussion with a focus on resolution. I smiled faintly. They weren't done. Neither were we. They thought I had no support. They thought isolation would weaken me. They thought pressure would make me disappear quietly. What they didn't understand, what they were only beginning to realize, was this: I came from a woman who knew how to stand in hostile rooms and remain unshaken. A woman who didn't need titles to command respect. A woman who taught me that silence isn't surrender, and support doesn't always announce itself until it's needed. And when my mother walked into that room with me, she didn't just change the conversation, she changed the outcome that everyone else had already assumed. Because now, they were no longer dealing with someone they could corner. They were dealing with a lineage, and that made all the difference. By Tuesday morning, the tone had shifted completely. Not because they'd suddenly found their conscience, not because they'd decided to be fair, but because fear had finally entered the room. And fear, when it belongs to people who are used to control, makes them sloppy.
The revised agenda landed in my inbox at 7:14 a.m. It was longer, more formal, filled with language meant to sound cooperative while quietly reasserting authority. Alignment, expectations, next steps. My mother read it once, then again. "They're trying to look reasonable," she said. "That's always the second move." "What's the first?" I asked. "Intimidation," she replied. "You already survived that." We didn't rush. That was important. They wanted urgency, panic, reaction. We gave them preparation. My mother helped me draft a response, polite, precise, non-committal. We asked for documentation, for written clarification, for a copy of the complaints they'd referenced. Each request was reasonable. Each one forced them to slow down. Power hates being slowed. The next meeting was scheduled for Thursday. Same room, same table, different energy. They arrived tense this time. No casual chatter, no confident smiles. And when they saw my mother again, still seated just behind me, still observing without interfering, I watched something subtle break behind their eyes. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't threatened anyone. She hadn't even introduced herself with credentials. And yet she unsettled them, because authority that doesn't need permission is dangerous to people who rely on structure to protect them. This meeting didn't start with concerns. It started with apologies, carefully worded, vague, non-admissions dressed up as regret, if there was any misunderstanding, if our intentions weren't clear, if this process felt abrupt. My mother said nothing. She didn't need to. I listened, took notes, waited. When they finished, the woman who'd called me defensive leaned forward. "We want to ensure you feel supported," she said. I met her eyes. "Then let's talk about what actually happened," I replied. The room stiffened. I laid it out, chronologically, calmly, without accusation. The meetings I'd been excluded from, the feedback I'd never received until it was weaponized, the suggestion to resign, framed as concern. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't apologize. I didn't soften. I simply told the truth. When I finished, the man cleared his throat. "That's one interpretation," he said. My mother leaned forward slightly. "No," she said, "that's a record." He blinked. "Excuse me?" "She documented dates, language, and witnesses," my mother continued evenly. "Interpretation is subjective. Documentation is not." Silence. Thick. Uncomfortable. They tried a different tactic then. Isolation. "We understand emotions can influence perception," the man said, turning toward me. "Perhaps we should speak one-on-one going forward." My mother smiled. "No," she said again, "you shouldn't." The woman frowned. "With all due respect—" "With respect," my mother replied calmly, "you attempted to remove my daughter without representation. You don't get to control the setting now." That was the moment they realized they'd miscalculated. By the end of the meeting, there was no resignation on the table, no mutual separation. Instead, there was an agreement, reluctant, careful, legally scrubbed, to pause all action pending a formal review. It wasn't justice, but it was leverage. Outside, in the hallway, I leaned against the wall and exhaled. My legs felt weak. "I don't know how you stayed so calm," I said. My mother adjusted her coat. "Because I've done where you are, and I know this part passes." The review process was slow, painfully slow. Weeks of interviews, emails, policy references. They asked me to recount everything again, to relive moments I'd tried to minimize just to survive. My mother was there for every preparation session. She didn't coach me on what to say. She reminded me of who I was. "Don't explain more than necessary," she'd say. "Don't apologize for clarity. Silence after a question is your friend." Those lessons stayed with me. Not everyone was on my side. Some colleagues avoided me completely. Others suddenly became overly friendly, too late. I learned to recognize fear disguised as politeness, and something else too. I learned that when people sense power shifting, they reveal who they really are. One afternoon, during the third week of review, I received a message from someone I barely knew. "I've been through this too. I didn't fight. I wish I had." I stared at it for a long time. Then another came. "Thank you for standing up. It matters more than you know." I hadn't realized how many people were watching, waiting. The review culminated in one final meeting. This time, the room felt different. HR was present, legal counsel, neutral faces. My mother sat beside me, not behind. That shift was intentional. She wasn't just support anymore. She was recognized. The findings were read aloud. Not dramatic, not emotional, clinical. Inconsistencies in process, lack of documented performance concerns, inappropriate recommendation of resignation. Each phrase landed with weight. When it was over, the room was quiet. The man who'd led the original push cleared his throat. "We'll need to recalibrate," he said. My mother nodded. "Yes," she replied. "You will." The outcome wasn't revenge. No one was fired on the spot. No public apology was issued. But something irreversible happened. I wasn't expendable anymore. That afternoon, as we walked out of the building, I felt lighter than I had in months. Not victorious, validated. They hadn't won, and neither had I, but I'd survived intact. On the drive home, I finally asked the question that had been sitting in my chest since Friday. "Why did you come so fast?" I asked. "You didn't hesitate." My mother glanced at me. "Because I recognized the look in your voice," she said. "The one that says someone is trying to convince you that you're alone." I swallowed. "I didn't want to burden you." She shook her head. "You weren't a burden," she said. "You were my daughter." That night, lying in bed, I replayed everything. The first meeting, the fear, the silence, and then my mother walking into that room like she belonged there. Because she did. They thought I had no support. They thought isolation would break me. They thought pressure would make me fold. What they didn't understand was this. I came from a woman who had survived worse rooms than theirs, who had raised a daughter to be quiet but not weak, who knew exactly when silence was no longer the answer. Part 3 wasn't the end of the fight, but it was the moment the power shifted permanently. Because once people realize you're not alone, they stop trying to corner you. And once they see who stands behind you, they start choosing their words very carefully. The strangest part wasn't the waiting, it was the watching. After the review concluded, after the findings were documented and the tone inside the building quietly shifted, I became aware of something I'd never experienced before. People were measuring themselves around me, not openly, not aggressively, subtly. Conversations paused when I walked by. Emails were worded more carefully. Meetings suddenly had agendas and minutes. It wasn't respect born of admiration, it was caution born of awareness. They knew now that I wasn't isolated, and more importantly, they knew I wasn't ignorant. That kind of knowledge changes everything. The first sign came when I was invited, formally, to a meeting I'd previously been excluded from. The calendar invite was polite, almost deferential. Your presence would be valuable. I stared at the phrase longer than necessary. It used to sting when I wasn't invited. Now the invitation itself felt heavy because I knew what it represented. Correction. My mother noticed the shift too. "They're recalibrating their behavior," she said one evening as we sat in my living room. "That means they're afraid of repeating the mistake." "Is that good?" I asked. She smiled faintly. "It's not justice," she said, "but it's accountability adjacent." I laughed softly. "That sounds like something you'd say." She shrugged. "I've learned to take progress where I can get it." Not everyone handled the change well. The man who had suggested I resign avoided me entirely. He delegated interactions, sent others in his place. The woman who'd accused me of being defensive tried something else, overcompensation. She smiled too much, complimented too frequently, asked for my input publicly in ways that felt performative. I didn't respond to either tactic. I did my work. That was the point. One afternoon, I was called into a meeting unexpectedly, not disciplinary, strategic. They wanted my opinion on a project I'd once been shut out of entirely. I listened, asked questions, offered insight. No one interrupted. No one dismissed. And when the meeting ended, someone said something I'd never heard before. "Thank you for pushing back," they said. "We needed that." I nodded, not because I was surprised, but because I finally believed it. The power shift wasn't just external, it was internal. I stopped bracing before interactions, stopped rehearsing explanations, stopped softening my tone out of fear it would be misinterpreted. I wasn't aggressive, I was clear. And clarity, I learned, unsettles people who rely on ambiguity to maintain control. My mother began stepping back slowly, not because she wasn't needed, but because the moment demanded it. "This part is yours," she said one morning as she packed her bag. "I didn't come to fight your battles.
I came to remind you who you are." I hugged her tightly. "You changed everything," I said. She shook her head. "No," she replied. "I stood still while you stepped forward." The review process closed officially 2 weeks later. No fanfare, just an email. Subject, process conclusion. The language was neutral, careful, sanitized, but the subtext was unmistakable. They would not try that again. I thought I'd feel victorious. I didn't. I felt grounded. Because what I'd gained wasn't dominance. It was footing. There were still consequences. Not everyone forgave me for surviving. Some colleagues distanced themselves, not because they disliked me, but because proximity now felt risky. Others leaned in, quietly grateful that someone had challenged what they'd been too afraid to name. One woman stopped me in the hallway and whispered, "Thank you." That was enough. The hardest part came unexpectedly. One evening, after everything had quieted, I sat alone on my couch and felt something unfamiliar. Grief, not for what I'd lost, for what I'd endured without realizing I didn't have to. Years of silence, years of shrinking, years of believing that strength meant standing alone. I cried, not because I was weak, but because I was done pretending I had to be invincible. My mother called that night. "How are you holding up?" she asked. "I think I'm finally letting myself feel it," I replied. She hummed softly. "That's usually what comes after safety," she said. "The body releases what it was holding." I exhaled deeply. I didn't know how tired I was, I admitted. She smiled through the phone. "You don't rest in the middle of a storm," she said. "You rest when it passes." The next week, something unexpected happened. The organization announced changes, policy revisions, process updates, clearer documentation requirements. No names were mentioned, but everyone knew. I watched from my desk as emails circulated, conversations shifted, and a culture that once relied on silence and assumption began, slowly, to crack. Not because of me alone, but because someone had finally refused to disappear quietly. My role changed subtly, not in title, in presence. People asked my opinion and waited for the answer. They didn't always agree, but they listened. That was new. One afternoon, the same man who'd suggested I resign approached me. He looked uncomfortable. He began, "I wanted to say," then paused. I misjudged the situation. I said nothing. "And you," he added. I raised an eyebrow slightly. He cleared his throat. "You handled it professionally." It wasn't an apology, but it was a concession. I nodded. "Thank you," I said. That was all. Later that evening, I met my mother for dinner. She studied my face carefully. "You're different," she said. "I feel different," I replied. "How so?" "I'm not afraid of rooms anymore," I said, "even when I walk in alone." She smiled. "That's because you know you're not," she replied, "even when no one else is there." The truth was, I didn't need her to walk into rooms with me anymore, but I would always carry the memory of the moment she did, the way the air changed, the way confidence cracked, the way power rebalanced itself when presence met truth. They thought I had no support. They thought isolation would weaken me. They thought silence meant surrender. What they didn't understand was this: support doesn't always look like a crowd. Sometimes it looks like one woman walking into a room and standing quietly behind you, long enough for everyone else to realize you were never alone. Learning how to live after the storm without waiting for the next one. Learning that strength doesn't mean solitude. And learning that when people underestimate your support system, they underestimate you. The day everything finally settled didn't feel triumphant. It felt quiet. So quiet, in fact, that at first I wondered if I was imagining it,
if the tension that had wrapped itself around my chest for months had really loosened, or if I was just waiting for the next blow. But the blow never came, and that was how I knew it was over. The final confirmation arrived in the most unceremonious way possible. An email. No urgency tag, no carefully veiled threats, no passive-aggressive phrasing dressed up as professionalism, just facts. Subject: role confirmation and forward plan. They confirmed my position, outlined expectations, this time clearly, assigned a new reporting structure, and closed with a sentence that made my hands tremble slightly as I read it. We appreciate your continued contribution and look forward to rebuilding trust. Rebuilding. Not managing, not correcting, not monitoring. Rebuilding. I closed my laptop and sat back in my chair, staring at the ceiling. For the first time in a very long time, my body didn't feel like it was waiting to be attacked. I didn't call my mother right away. Not because I didn't want to share the news, but because I wanted to sit in it first, to let the moment belong to me. I made tea, stood by the window, watched the city move like it always had, indifferent to my personal war, unaware that something fundamental had shifted inside one small apartment. I hadn't won, but I hadn't lost myself either, and that felt like everything. When I finally called her, she answered on the second ring. "It's done," I said. She didn't ask what I meant. "I know," she replied. I smiled. I continued. They confirmed everything. No more review, no more pressure. There was a pause. Then she exhaled slowly. "I'm proud of you," she said. Not relieved, not celebratory, proud. That distinction mattered. The following weeks were normal, strangely so. I went to work, did my job, participated in meetings without feeling like I was walking into a trap. People spoke to me directly instead of around me. Some were careful, some were awkward, some acted like nothing had ever happened. And that was fine, because I remembered, and that was enough. The real change revealed itself in moments so small they almost went unnoticed. The way my shoulders stayed relaxed in meetings, the way my voice didn't waver when I disagreed, the way I no longer checked my email with dread first thing in the morning. Fear had been replaced by something steadier, confidence, not the loud kind, the kind that doesn't need witnesses. One afternoon, I was asked to mentor a new hire. The request surprised me. When she arrived at my desk, she looked nervous, eager, but guarded. She said, "I've heard you're honest," she said carefully. I smiled. "I tried to be clear," I replied. She hesitated. "I just wanted to say," she added quietly, "I've never seen anyone stand up to them the way you did." I studied her face. "You don't have to stand alone," I said, "even when it feels like you are." Her eyes softened. That was when it hit me. What had happened hadn't just protected me, it had changed the landscape, if only slightly, for everyone watching. My mother came to visit a few weeks later, not as my defender, just as my mother. We went out to dinner, talked about ordinary things, laughed. At one point, she studied me over her glass of water. "You look settled," she said. "I feel rooted," I replied, "like I'm not floating anymore." She nodded. "That's what happens when you stop doubting your right to exist in a room," she said. I thought back to the day she'd walked into that building with me, how steady she'd been, how unshaken. "You taught me that," I said. She smiled softly. "I reminded you," she corrected. "You already knew." The truth was, I had spent years believing strength meant standing alone, that asking for help was weakness, that leaning on someone, even briefly, meant I wasn't capable enough. I had been wrong. Strength wasn't isolation, it was discernment, knowing when to stand alone and when to let someone stand with you. There was one final moment that sealed everything.
Months later, during a meeting, a familiar tactic surfaced, a vague criticism, a suggestion without specifics, a quiet attempt to shift blame. The room went still. I didn't flinch. "I'll need clarity on that," I said calmly. "What specifically are you referring to?" The person hesitated, stumbled, then backtracked. The moment passed, but I felt it, the difference. They no longer assumed I'd absorbed the discomfort. They knew I wouldn't. That night, walking home, I thought about how close I'd come to disappearing quietly, how easily it could have ended differently if I'd believed their version of the story, if I'd believed I was alone, if I hadn't made that call.
They thought I had no support. They thought that isolation would make me compliant. They thought silence meant surrender. They were wrong. My mother didn't storm in, didn't shout, didn't threaten. She stood. And in doing so, she shifted the balance just enough for me to step forward. That was the lesson. Support doesn't always look like protection. Sometimes it looks like presence. I still carry her voice with me, not literally, but in the way I approach rooms now, in the way I pause before shrinking, in the way I trust my instincts, in the way I refuse to disappear for someone else's comfort. People assume the story ends with triumph, with applause, with some visible reward. It doesn't. It ends with something quieter. Peace. The kind that settles in your bones and stays. The kind that doesn't ask permission. They thought I had no support until my mother arrived and changed everything. But the truth is, she didn't change me. She reminded me. And once I remembered who I was, no one could make me feel alone again.